So is a God who endorses slavery truly worth following, and is this being moral? And so the skeptic looks at the Old Testament and says, God endorses slavery. This cannot be a good God. All right, so the very first thing we have to do is we have to define our terms. We have to ask, well, what do we mean by slavery? When we look at the Old Testament, what is meant by slavery? Because you and I come with these modern assumptions. So we hear slavery and we think Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, right? Black slavery, African American slavery, beating slaves. These are the kind of thoughts and images that come to our mind. And then what we do is we just simply import that into our reading of the Old Testament. But is the slavery that we think of today the quote-unquote slavery that we see in the Old Testament? And actually, I think when we look at this carefully, we do not have the same thing. In fact, I think a better word to use for the Old Testament concept there is servanthood. Now, you might say, oh, okay, we're just playing word games here. Well, no, think about it. In the Old Testament, slavery or servanthood, or what you might call debt servanthood, was entered into voluntarily. And so maybe the modern day example to think about would be like a live-in employee. So I may have someone who is a nanny or a housekeeper who might live with me, and we might have a voluntary arrangement, kind of a contract. Well, when you look at the Old Testament, you look at what's going on there, this is what slavery was. It was servanthood. It was kind of a contractual, voluntary arrangement for someone maybe to pay off a debt. And so someone's crops are wiped out by some natural disaster and they lose everything. There was an option, rather than just be destitute and be in poverty and not be able to take care of you or your family, there was an option for you to sell yourself into servanthood to pay off those debts. But it was a voluntary contract that you would enter into. And there was provisions within Israel's laws so that there wouldn't be abuses. And so it's not that this was promoted by Israel's law, but there was provisions provided for this kind of arrangement. And it was actually a way that would help alleviate poverty. But it wasn't that slaves were kind of beaten and forced into slavery for the rest of their lives. In fact, when you look at Old Testament law, there was provision that all slaves would be released after 7 years. Now, a slave, a servant, could attach themselves to the master. If they had a great master and they wanted to kind of make a lifelong commitment, they could do that. But again, it was voluntary. And so when you look at the concept of slavery in the Old Testament, very different than the concept of slavery that we have today. Not the kind of abuses that we think of when we think of, Civil War era. And so we don't have the same kind of thing. And it's not that this was even the ideal. God was taking humanity kind of where they were at and actually offering improvement. When you compare Israel's views and laws on this compared to other different nations at that same time, you see that Israel laws were a major improvement. And so God didn't say, hey, this is the ideal, sell yourself into servanthood. No, he made the provision, taking humanity where it was at, but then eventually the ideas of the Old and New Testament undermine the kind of slavery that we see in the Civil War era, antebellum slavery. And in fact, if the slave owners had followed the Old Testament laws and kind of the provisions laid out for Israel, we wouldn't have had the kind of slavery we had during the Civil War era. And so, no, God doesn't endorse the kind of slavery that we think about, and so therefore it doesn't call into question his moral character.